Hello everybody, this is Nick from Nick's Listening Space, and today we're going to talk about the Starke Sound Beta 5s. So this, to me, is one of the most interesting compact speakers that I've ever had the pleasure of listening to. Now, one of the reasons why is because I think that it doesn't quite fit into one particular category, but rather it kind of sits somewhere between two different speakers that I currently have. So essentially, I think that this sits somewhere between the precision of a KEF LS50 and kind of the warmth of an ELAC Debut DB63. Now, I think what makes this interesting is really what kind of amplifier we're going to pair with it, as well as how we place the speaker in your particular space. I think that with this particular speaker, when kind of all of those things lock in, there's a level of palpability, or really what I would like to think of as physicality here, that I think makes this speaker feel incredibly real for this price point. So when I say palpability, what I really mean here is that sound doesn't just exist in space, but it has a sense of weight. For me, there is an impact to kick drums and a presence with guitar strings here, and even a sense of space around vocals. There is like a real illusion that sound has weight here. And I think that that's one of the things that kind of made this a difficult speaker for me to review, coming off of my KEFs as well as the ELACs. So in this video, I'm going to focus on how they behave, especially across different amplifiers as well as different placements. And, depending on how well this video is received and whether or not you guys want to see a more in-depth comparison, I might do a separate video where I compare these with the KEF LS50s and the ELAC Debut DB63 series. My first impressions here, like kind of right out of the box, are that the Beta 5 really immediately struck me as a very natural sounding speaker. To me, there's no sense of exaggeration, or at least no boosted highs or no kind of bloated bass. To me, they're just grounded, controlled, and I think that what really caught my attention in my initial listening of these was the bass. Now, not in how much bass that these are going to produce, but rather how it behaves. So the bass on the Starke Sound Beta 5s is tight, fast, and it's controlled. There is a real sense of weight and authority here that is really surprising for something only costing $500. To me, there is a sense that kick drums are not being reproduced, but rather they are happening in the room. So there's an album I talk about all the time on this channel called No Better Time Than Now from an artist called Shigeto. And it's an album that has a lot of electronic samples and a lot of kind of really interesting kind of spatial effects and panning and things going on. And it's an album where I wouldn't necessarily think the drum samples on there are something that were recorded in a studio, rather there's something that came from a drum pack or a sample. But listening to that album on these speakers gave me a sense of realism in those drums like I never heard before. And that sounds crazy, but it's really seriously true. It's like you can really hear that there is a microphone being mic'd up inside of the drum, if that makes any sense. There is a sense of air and weight, and you can hear all of those like things that are coming with the sound of the kick drum. And essentially this is what I want to call palpability. Now, the second thing that really stands out here is its sense of timbre. And especially with acoustic guitars, I've been listening to a lot of Johnny Cash, and the guitar texture and quality that I get with these is so realistic that I'm like in the room and somebody's playing the guitar, right? To me, these sound incredibly clean, natural, and unforced. And to me, there's no artificial edge here or no coloration. There's nothing really that kind of jumps out at you as being unnatural. And really at this point, like to me, this is when I really began to be convinced by the quality of these. You know, lots of people have raved about these, but I was still kind of questioning that, you know, when I first got these. And so one of the things that I wanted to do from here was really experiment with placement and then trying out different amplifiers. Before I get any deeper on the sound quality, I want to talk about the build quality, because I think that what Starke Sound is doing here is really impressive for $500. So these guys are going to come double boxed in 2 layers of cardboard, and in addition to that, they come packaged in some of the nicest, densest foam that I've ever seen with a piece of equipment. And in addition to that, they also come in a really nice fabric cloth bag. This feels incredibly deliberate and thought out, not like an afterthought. They didn't just design a speaker and then throw it in a box with some styrofoam and ship it off. They really thought about the packaging, and I'm very pleased to say these came delivered and they were not damaged or any of that. Now these guys are sitting at around 15 pounds a piece, and they feel incredibly solid and dense. Now, I want to say they're not as solid and dense feeling as my KEF LS50s, but in a lot of ways, these are more dense and solid than the ELAC Debut DB63s that I also have. Now, the cabinet is not using a real wood. This is a laminate veneer, but I have to say that this is very well executed. You know, this is kind of akin to what you would find in a multi-family project built in the last, 5 or 6 years. The edges here are nice and clean and consistent, and they give me confidence here that they're not just going to fall apart or start to delaminate. Now, when we get around to the front baffle of this guy, we really are presented with something that I think is just a very honest design. We have exposed screws on the front, as well as kind of these exposed grill inserts that you also get. Now, the ELAC Debuts have magnetic and it's a little bit more sleek. Really what we get here is something that represents function a little bit more so than form. And I think that that's okay, honestly. And many people might really enjoy this look. Now, if you are somebody that does not like the appearance of that, you could run these with the integrated grills. And I do think these really class up the aesthetic of them quite a bit. Other reviewers have mentioned that when they measure these, this will kind of slightly change the overall frequency curve. But that's pretty typical of many speakers when you put the grill on and off. Now, in regards to the drivers, these are not off-the-shelf components. These are something that Starke has gone out, designed, and engineered from the ground up. So the woofer is a 5¼ inch woofer, and the tweeter is a 29mm silk dome tweeter. Now, they have what they call their HEMF system, or their hybrid motor system that they have developed in-house. I won't talk too much about that, but essentially it's their own proprietary technology. Essentially you're getting, for $500, something that is designed, engineered in-house. And supposedly they have their own manufacturing facility where they're making these. So before we talk too much about use case and system context, I want to ground this review with some context. So these guys are 86 dB sensitive, and they are 4 ohm nominal impedance, and they're rated for around 30 to 150 watts. So the key detail here that I want to discuss is that they are a 4 ohm speaker. Now what this means is that with 4 ohm speakers and below, you want to consider sensitivity and amplifier pairing, because essentially you're going to want a high current or a high amount of current to power them. Now I'll talk a little bit more about that when I discuss different amp pairings. In terms of room size though, these are ideal for small to kind of small medium sized rooms. For reference, my room is about 250 square feet. I have a lot of irregular walls, and pretty much non-parallel walls in my space. Now the bass extension is rated at around 45 Hertz, and in my room that was enough to feel complete. But I do think in larger rooms, you'll likely want to have a subwoofer if you are really going for a full range kind of impact. If you are especially trying to pair this with, you know, or let's just say you want to watch a lot of movies and things of that nature. Now, when it comes to the placement on these, that's always a discussion, as it is with pretty much any speaker, because placement is going to be a part of the tuning. So initially, I placed these in the same exact setup as I placed my KEF LS50s. So that's sort of straight out in the room with no toe in. Now, my first reaction here was that they were a bit underwhelming. At least for me, I wasn't quite getting that center image that I'm so used to getting. But with a little toe in, I found the center image come into place. And from here, I also was given a little bit more energy and excitement. And for me, this is really when we start to get depth and width and a full immersive soundstage. So this is really also where this idea of palpability really starts to show up for me. So when this image locks in properly, instruments stopped feeling like they were just placed in space, but rather started to feel like they have weight and presence. Now, from here is where I started to experiment with distance from the wall. So when we pull these out about 2 to 3 feet, for me at least, this is where I get the best results. And what I'm doing here is I'm using the rule of thirds. And in this scenario, I'm getting the most amount of depth and air. But of course, there's always a trade-off. So what is the trade-off? The trade-off is that you do lose some of that mid-range weight or some of that kind of vocal presence. But what you get is a sense of spaciousness, clarity, and openness. So I also tried pushing them further back and out toward the corners of my room. Now, when I do this, this increases the bass as well as the width of the soundstage. But really what we start to lose out on is kind of that clarity. In a sense, we get a little bit more of this mud and a little bit more of this reduced instrument separation. So I think what I'm trying to explain to you here is that when you get these in your room, as with any speakers, play with the placement. Don't just settle on one position. And I'm trying to give you an idea of what might you hear when you get them in your space and how you may place them. You know, placement is always kind of this second round kind of tuning fork, or rather it's this second round of kind of ability to tune the speakers. And I think that there's a balance here with what you ultimately want, whether you want more bass and a little bit more of that boom, or whether you want just pure clarity. So personally for me, I preferred them more pulled out into the room, because for me at least, this is where I get, again, the most amount of spaciousness, but also the most amount of controlled low end, or at least the most convincing and the most realistic low end. So the sound staging on these speakers is very impressive for this price point. I think that what we get for $500 is very good depth, clear separation, a very solid center image here that I think you can achieve when you get these properly placed. So, but what matters more for me, I think, is how they build a sense of presence. Because for these, there is such a real palpability and realism and naturalness. It's very hard to describe, but again, it's like instruments are not being reproduced. They sound incredibly in the room and real. And having said all that, I do think they lean a little bit more kind of in that analytical realm, but at the same time, they are never harsh sounding. They're never bright or sharp. And when we compare these directly with the LS50s, the KEFs to me still win out in this holography and this top end extension. There is more sparkle and more micro detail, or rather just more of this like magical airy quality on my KEF LS50s. But I think that the Beta 5s trade some of that for a more grounded, realistic sound. At least to me, everything sounds more stable, more physical. They're less exciting and perhaps a little bit less like pizzazz and pop in them, if that makes any sense. What stands out for me on these is their low end. As I've already said, not in the quantity of it, but in the quality. Because I think what you get here is a fast, controlled, and an extremely well-defined low end. More importantly here, it has this level of palpability. Kick drums feel incredibly real. They have a sense of impact and authority. There is a sense of air moving, not just the sound being reproduced. So on a track like The Sun by Mid, the bass locks into this groove in a way that is so hard to ignore. And I've heard that song 150 times on my KEF LS50, but for whatever reason, it just felt so physically rhythmic and engaging on these. And it's really just the quality of the low end here, I think, is above and beyond this $500 price point. How are the mid-range? What is the dynamics of this guy like? Well, I think the mid-range here is incredibly clean and natural sounding, much like the low end. Vocals come through here with clarity and presence without ever being forward. So, you know, sometimes the vocals on the KEF LS50 can be forward and also kind of reach that level of sharpness and excitement. But rather what we get on the Beta 5s, I think, is a very similar kind of clarity, but without this kind of overly forward sound. So there is a kind of, like they have the clarity of the KEF LS50, but they have a liquidity to them. There is a ease and a lushness there that is not quite found in the KEF LS50s. At least not until we really start to put expensive electronics on the LS50s. With these, you can do this with much more affordable amps, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. You know, just to reiterate, but these are essentially not as explosive or as dynamic as the KEF LS50s. These are more forgiving. So, to my ears, these are not as dynamic as the LS50s. They seem more well kind of balanced and a much flatter frequency response. I think what that results in is a less fatiguing speaker, especially over long periods of listening. It just seems like a kind of more balanced speaker to me. You know, after 3 weeks of listening to these guys, the best way that I can really describe them is that these sit somewhere between a KEF LS50 and an ELAC Debut. But they really behave like neither. In a lot of ways, this is kind of borrowing the best characteristics of both. They seem to have this clarity and this accuracy that the KEFs are really known for, but at the same time, there is also this mid-range, low-end smoothness and ease and lushness that lends it to kind of being the best of both worlds, if that makes any sense. You know, they truly have this KEF-like clarity without that aggressive top end. They have this ELAC-like smoothness, but they have way more control and authority of the low end. You know, essentially the ELACs have more bloom in the low end. These are going to be tighter in the low end. These have a sense that sound has weight and presence and a sense of realism. And I think it really stems from that quality of the low end and the mid-range. These do not demand your attention like my KEF LS50s. I think in many people's homes, these might be an easier speaker to live with. In a sense, I love my KEFs for highly intentional, focused listening sessions. I think what's interesting about these is I kind of found myself just leaving them on all day long, playing even at low volumes, and it's because they really are not a fatiguing speaker. So I want to talk about the amp pairings here because I think this is where things get a little bit interesting, and I think we'll add a little bit more context to the discussion, because really for me, my favorite pairing with these, I think, is the Fozzy Audio V3 monos, and that's not something I quite expected. I think that because of that 4 ohm load, they're best served with a very high current or a lot of power. And right now the V3 monos are dishing out, more than 300 watts here into these guys. They really are, I think, the best pairing for the maximum amount of control in the low end. I think what we get here is the tightest bass, but also the strongest amount of dynamics. This for me is really where this palpability or this sense of realism sounds the best, or the best really. I also paired these with my line magnetic using my KT88s as well as my EL34s. The line magnetic is going to add more air and more space and more emotion into these, and also a little bit less of a grippy bass. There is more bloom for sure in the low end. In a sense, the palpability or that realism shifts here kind of from that hard impact to a more of an atmospheric presentation. And I think that unlike my KEFs here, these lack that top end extension that I don't know if tubes are something that these really benefit from. I think a lot of people will enjoy these with tubes, but yeah, I was just so incredibly surprised by the performance of the V3 monos. And I think more on that discussion, Starke Sound has worked with the company Eversolo on kind of developing these speakers or pairing them or creating synergy with the Eversolo amps and streamers that are out right now. And I think that that is a discussion that might push somebody into buying these, because what this really shows is that right now you can buy a very affordable, easily accessible amplifier on the market that's efficient, Class D, doesn't put off a lot of heat, consumes very little power, and it's gonna pair incredibly well with these. Out of curiosity, I really wanted to see how these would perform with the SMSL A010 that I recently reviewed. If you watch that review, you know that that's a $100 amplifier, and that's pretty crazy and low priced. So how does that pair with these? Well, I have to say that with that guy, it is a more relaxed presentation. It's also a little bit more mid-range focused. With that amplifier, we are getting the least amount of power and I think the least amount of headroom. So really what that means is we're not going to be able to drive these to the highest levels. And just for kind of context here, with my V3 monos, I was able to drive those, north of 80 decibels with extreme clarity and control still being delivered. Where the SMSL kind of tops out is somewhere around your 70, 75 dB mark, which in my particular listening space is totally doable and works just fine. But, overall, I do think some people would really enjoy the softer presentation and a little bit less clarity that you get with the SMSL. And in a sense, I think if you're going for maybe a little bit more of that mid-range kind of emotional presentation, that might be the amplifier for you, and you could save a couple $100. My conclusion here of the Starke Sound Beta 5s is that for $500, the Beta 5 is a seriously compelling speaker. And when I compare this with my KEF LS50s, it's pretty crazy actually, because the KEFs are $1,500, these are $500. These are not going to win the flashy award by any means. I don't think these are as good looking as my KEF LS50s, but I do appreciate the honesty here that these are giving you. There is a sense of realism and palpability here that you really feel and not just hear. I think that this is a speaker that also is going to reward different amp pairings and really how you place it in a room. And that really kind of shows you that this is a speaker meant for audiophiles or people really looking to play with the tunability of a speaker. You know, my lasting remarks here are that, is this as good or better than my KEF LS50s? You know, I can't say that it is. I really am having a hard time deciding which one if I only had to live with one, which one would I choose? I think that's very difficult for me, because I think that I am still very much addicted to this top-end extension on my KEF LS50s. And one of the things that I'm really kind of perturbed by is my inability to test this guy out with something like a Hagel or a Parasound amplifier, because after listening to them with the V3 monos, I have a feeling these things are going to scale up even more. And I think that possibly looking at a much more expensive amplifier may really scale these guys up. That's as much as I can really talk about and comment on from my time with them, guys. If you like this review, please hit that like button. Please subscribe to my channel for more reviews. You know, let me know if you've heard these guys, you know, what do you think about them? Also, if there's another speaker that you think is as good as these or that sits around that $500 price point, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are there. If there's anything you think beats or competes with this, I'd love to hear about that. So thanks so much, guys, for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye. Increases the bait. And I think what that results in is a less